by the Massachusetts people. I honor them as ancestral keepers of the land that I am now living on, and I honor their descendants who continue to breathe sacred life into this land and all lands across this country. I am very honored to also have this conversation with Marie-Frances Rivera, who is a very dear friend and an amazing leader. Marie-Frances is the president of the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center, also known as MassBudget. Today, you're going to hear more about the organization and its important insight into the state's budget. There are many reasons why I'm excited about this conversation. In addition to addressing equity funding, I want to lift up our own stories as they relate to today's conversation. So do you mind, Marie-Frances, do you mind if we share a little bit about ourselves? And I'll go ahead and kick it off. So I was born and raised in San Antonio, Texas, by undocumented Mexican immigrants. Today's conversation really resonates for me. I came from a school in San Antonio that was actually part of a Supreme Court case about unequitable funding. It says a lot about my background, and I think the story of a lot of other Latina women and Latinos in general and other people of color. So for me, this conversation is really personal, and I'm just grateful to get to share it with a dear friend. So Marie-Frances, I'll turn it to you.
Thank you, Delia. And I didn't know that was part of your story. So thank you for sharing. And thank you to you and to your team and to Nellie Mae for inviting us to be part of this conversation. I'm really looking forward to it. So again, Marie-Frances Rivera. I was born in Puerto Rico. And when I was quite young, we moved to Florida, and then I was raised in New Bedford, Massachusetts. So here in Massachusetts, in a city, that's dubbed a gateway city, right? With a lot of diversity and immigrant populations such as ours. And I grew up in public schools as you did, and I grew up in a time period that I really benefited from my public school education. And, part of the reason why I do this work is because I want others to benefit from quality and well-funded public schools as well. I am also a mother of a 4-year-old who is going to hopefully be starting Boston Public Schools this September, where I'm waiting literally for BPS to let us know what our schools, top schools and schools that he can attend are. So I also have the urgency of being a mom that wants my child and his peers to have access to a quality and well-funded education. So that's me.
Well, thank you so much. And yeah. I'm always also learning from you and about you. So thank you. So let's kick off this conversation centered on equitable funding. So MassBudget is a public policy think tank researching and advocating for racial and economic justice. Can you tell us more about MassBudget? What are the organization's priorities at this time?
Sure. So we do work a lot on school funding, but we also work in many other areas. And, I really, as the president of the organization, feel that our work is urgently important. Our work in the realm of policy, in the realm of our state budget, many of us have talked about this on all of these virtual spaces that we're in, but we're in a very serious and critical moment in time right now, where the racist policies, that have been put in place, past and present, are really coming to a head. We're seeing this extreme economic inequality in the midst of this global pandemic that we're all working through. And we really feel at MassBudget very strongly that the state budget and equitable economic policies can be an extremely powerful tool to get us from where we are today to get us to a better and brighter future for our students, for our kids, for our communities. So I will share one slide right now, if you would not mind. And that's the title slide, but I'll share. So what we've been developing at MassBudget over the past year, I would say, is a policy platform. And what we're dubbing the policy platform is Envisioning Equity. So it's an emergent platform, it's an evolving platform, and it's designed to really address and try to create an inclusive Commonwealth. And it has 3 pillars. The first pillar being an anti-racist state budget, which is where this equitable school funding conversation sits. Another pillar is tax justice. So, the state budget is fueled by taxes and other revenues. And as we're thinking about making equitable investments, it's also important that we look at tax justice. Currently, our tax system is not just where lower income people are paying more of their income than higher income people. So we want to fix that at the same time that we're making smart investments. And the third pillar of the platform is around economic security for everybody. And some of the work that we're doing right now in this particular area is really looking at our unemployment system, since folks are really relying on it with the massive unemployment that we're seeing because of COVID, and making sure that it's a sustainable system, that it's an equitable system, making sure that there are other direct cash supports for folks regardless of immigration status. So that's some of the work that we're doing.
I appreciate how you named the various intersections of work, and also thinking about budgets show people's priorities, institutions' priorities. And that is very much the case, when I've been understanding more and more about the state budget. So I'd like to think a little bit more about the school finance, equity, and public policy, and how we can improve outcomes for young people. So decades of work at the foundation has really shown us that school districts in New England, and of course across the country, there's equitable funding. And for the folks on the call who may not be as familiar with funding as you and MassBudget are, could you tell us a little bit more about how we have ended up in this situation as a state?
Sure. So, I think most folks are familiar at this point, that the place that we are at today with our society being so unequal, by income and by race, was really because of policies of the past. So when we think about the inequities that we see in school in terms of school funding, there's also a history to that, right? And much of that inequality that we're seeing in school funding is really based on policies that allowed white families to establish and accumulate wealth through home ownership, and aligned policies that really excluded Black families from home ownership opportunities. So what that did, here in Massachusetts and around the country, was that it created many segregated communities. And so, they're wealthier white communities now that have the property wealth and higher incomes to tap in the form of property taxes to support their schools. And there are Black and brown communities that do not have that property wealth or that property wealth base to tap to supplement their schools. I'll go into more detail on that as we continue the conversation, but it reminds me of this often quoted statistic from a report a few years back from the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston that talked about the average wealth of a Black family in Greater Boston being $8 versus the average wealth of a white family being close to $250,000. So we see, that playing out in the way that we fund our schools.
I think I'm glad you raised that statistic, because I think when I saw it come out and other people heard about it, it really hopefully made us all pause and think about what are we doing that is so inequitable. What are the policies? What are the practices that were established long ago and that we continue supporting? Could you paint for us a picture of what this looks like in the schools?
Sure.
And I think you mentioned a couple places.
Yeah. So like I said, schools in Massachusetts are and equitably funded, similar to many, many other states. Massachusetts actually better than many other states. And the reason being was, I'll go through a little bit of a timeline, was that about 30 years ago, there was a recognition of this inequitable funding, and communities around the state organized, and there was legal action to pass what was called the Massachusetts Education Reform Act of 1993. So in 1993, and similar things were happening in New Jersey, all around the country, as you mentioned, right? And what the 1993 reforms did is that they created something called the Chapter 70 formula, which is how we fund our schools today. And what that formula tries to do is to break the tie between property wealth and then how schools are funded, to try and make it more equitable, so that a community like a New Bedford or a community like a Lawrence can get the amount of funding that students really need. So I'm going to share this slide very quickly. And so this chart that I shared here is funding, school funding, K through 12 school funding in Massachusetts from 1993 to 2002, essentially a decade-long period. And 1993 being the year that the reform was passed. So this reform of 1993 was quite equitable, and as you can see, funding that was going to schools nearly doubled during this time period. And I have presented the slide many times, and my colleague, Colin Jones, who is the mastermind of a lot of this data and research, also present this. We were both in elementary, middle school during this time, and we always reflect on the fact that, yeah, this reform really did benefit us, right? So we saw test scores go up. The Massachusetts being top in the country for literacy, a lot of these things happened through this education reform that happened in the 90s. So worked very well, not for everybody, not for all students, but it was working well. And what we've seen in the past 2 decades is that, funding has stagnated and even dipped a little bit for K through 12 schools. But what's happened underneath those numbers is the inequities that we see between wealthier white districts and lower income districts, districts with a lot of students of color. Those gaps in funding have continued to grow for a couple of reasons. So I'm gonna just continue on a little bit. And I'm gonna give us an example of how that plays out in particular communities. So this is, to move this a little bit. So I'm gonna walk us through a little bit like a 101 on how our schools are funded, just to illustrate this point too. So the Chapter 70 law, it essentially establishes a minimum floor of how much it costs to educate a student in a particular community. And it looks at the community's demographics, it looks at the ages of the students, et cetera. So I'm using I'm using Holyoke and I'm using Weston. And for those that aren't familiar with Holyoke or Weston, Holyoke is a predominantly Latinx community, lower income community in Massachusetts. Weston is a very wealthy majority white community. So what the Chapter 70 formula says is that in Holyoke, it typically takes about $13,000 to $14,000 to educate a student in Holyoke, versus in Weston, it takes about $10,000 to educate a student in Weston. Okay. And so what happens is that the Chapter 70 formula also says, okay, based on your city or town's property wealth, the income that you guys have, we're gonna say that you need to contribute this much directly to funding students in schools. So for Holyoke, because not too much property wealth, lower incomes, the state says, you have to put in $1,600 to support students, versus a place like Weston, where it's closer to $9,000. So then what happens after that is that the state makes up the difference, essentially. and brings it up to the minimum floor that's required to support a student in that particular district. The rub and the challenge that we're seeing today is that communities like Weston can do an additional local contribution based on the property, wealth, and the tax base that they have locally. And this is an example of a Holyoke and Weston, but we do see this play out pretty systematically across the Commonwealth, where communities like Weston are recognizing that actually it takes more than $10, $11, $12, $13,000 to educate a student. We actually believe that it takes $23,000 to educate our students. So we are going to locally contribute to get us up to that level. So I have a couple more slides, but I'll stop there.
I'm a little, excuse me, I'm actually a little speechless when I see all these numbers. I'm taken by the great inequities. And I know we're only talking about education right now, but it's easy to translate this conversation into other sectors. But, and as I hear these numbers, Marie-Frances, it also makes me think about the students in Weston. Not only do they have access to more resources inside the school, I think most of us can also recognize that these same young people have extra enrichment programs supported by parents. And then I also think about probably coming from families where there's 2 college graduates. All the data we've read over the years just really shows us how, as long as we continue using this type of formula, there will always be a big divide.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and people say it's not all about the money. It's not all about the money. There are studies that show that it is about the money. Very valid academic research that really shows that sustained support for students, sustained funding support for students can change life outcomes. It changes the academic outcomes for students. It also long-term changes the trajectory in terms of how much income they can make in their lives. It really does make a difference. And I think this slide here really does illustrate that, there are folks that really do believe that it costs this much to educate students, and that it really, this is how much it takes. So I'll show one more slide and we can move on to another part of the conversation. But just because I don't want you all to think that I'm cherry picking districts here, just to show you a little bit more information. So this slide here and this chart here basically breaks down incomes by the property, wealth, and income in a community, from lower income communities to higher income communities. The blue bar shows how much the foundation budget says is the floor for how much you can support, how much you need to support a child, and the yellow bar is what these communities are actually spending. So we see here that there's a trend line with communities that can't afford to support their students at higher levels do. So,
thank you. So I'd like to take a look at an effort, a recent effort to get more funds into communities like Holyoke and others. So some folks on the call might remember that in late 2019, Massachusetts lawmakers passed the Student Opportunity Act, which was a major school finance reform aimed at allocating an additional $1.5 billion to state public schools. It was going to be phased out over 7 years. I think when I mentioned that this happened, I think it was like November of 2019, and then we all know what happened early 2020, COVID and everything else. So can you tell us what's the status of that law and where we are right now in general?
Sure. So yeah, most folks on the call might be familiar with it. And as you mentioned, passed in late 2019. And then unfortunately, as we were planning to phase it in, COVID hit, and COVID hit hard. COVID hit our state budget, hit our schools, et cetera. So we are a bit behind on the amount of state support that we've put into beginning to implement this new reform. And it's unfortunate because, you know, some of the districts that would have benefited most from the Student Opportunity Act are, you know, and I'll share quickly, are places that are really being hit hard in many, many ways, places that are being hit disproportionately hard by COVID and many other things. So this is a slide here that just shows, you know, the districts that are essentially most harmed by not implementing the Student Opportunity Act in the timeline that we said that we would. And you see, you know, cities like Brockton and Lynn and Worcester, Lawrence, Springfield, predominantly cities with large populations of students of color. You know, there's a little more to the story at this point because we have been getting federal funding that has been coming in. And I can detail that a little bit more later, but we still at the state level need to make sure that we're doing our best to uphold our promises to students and communities around the Student Opportunity Act. And you know, my hope is that chart that I showed you from 1993 to 2002, that we can begin that trajectory of really making sure that we're funding schools and funding schools that desperately need the support now at the levels that we promised back in 2019.
And I also think about this being a very collective effort. So I'm wondering, you know, I'm listening to painful but important data, and I can't help but think about, you know, the concept of knowledge is power. How are folks at MassBudget thinking of getting this information out to community members who are most impacted by, you know, number one, the Student Opportunity Act, the fact that it's being held up. And I know we're going to talk a little bit later again about other resources. How can we get this information to others? Yeah,
so, you know, at MassBudget, we are kind of in the business of producing this research and making sure that it gets out to the hands of community members. And so we do a lot of presentations similar to this. My colleague, Colin Jones, who's our senior education analyst, anybody that's working on K through 12 funding in the state knows Colin. And he does an excellent job of getting out to classrooms, getting out to communities to just explain the basics of how schools are funded, because, you know, and trying to do it in a way that's accessible too. So, you know, we do our best to get this information into people's hands and to give it to folks that can share it with others. And I think it's critically important to understand sort of the basics of how schools are funded. But I think it's even more important to, you know, and we talked about this a little bit, Delia, to support groups that are organizing in low-income schools and in communities like Lawrence, like Lynn, like Chelsea, that can have, you know, that can hold space for conversations around what we want our schools to look like and feel like. Because it is important to understand, yes, my school, you know, and I think people do innately understand my school is underfunded, but then it's also critically important that, you know, that students and teachers and families create a vision for what they want in their schools. And I know that, you know, Nellie May funds many, many groups, you know, across New England, you know, some of whom we work closely with that are having those conversations about envisioning what we want our classrooms, what we want our schools to look and feel like in a way that is responsive to students of color and to low-income students and all students.
Very true. I think I know that at Nellie May, we're very proud to partner with a number of grassroots organizations who were at the forefront of leading some of this work and continue to be, you know, fighting for this act to be implemented. And yeah, I just want to underline, like, one of Nellie May's values is community voice. So I am grateful to partner with MassBudget today, so we can all collectively kind of bring this information out there and also think of who's still not getting it. So it's just reassuring to hear the work that you folks are doing.
Yeah, and one other thing too is, you know, the Student Opportunity Act would not be something that is in the books, but is currently underfunded, but would not be a law that was passed if not for the organizing efforts of many, many young people. It took a coalition of community groups and union support and, a massive amount of people to really get this law passed. So, and now it's just, we have it in the books, and now it's the additional effort of making sure that it's not another unfunded mandate that we have.
Correct. Yeah, correct. Well, I'm very much for thinking about how do we continue supporting those voices. So what is your vision for the state and the nation's schools in terms of how they should be funded and supported through the state and federal government?
Mm-hmm. So, we believe strongly that in terms of our schools, in terms of anything that's sort of in the public good realm, whether it's transit, healthcare, et cetera, we need a very strong state and federal partnership to fund, to support. And luckily we are in this era with a favorable federal administration, right? So that we know that we can rely on the federal government for the time being for support. So, and I'll show you a couple of slides here that just show kind of how critically this state and federal partnership is at this time of us being in a recession, essentially. So, I started out with talking about how the state essentially isn't meeting up to their promise of funding the Student Opportunity Act. So I'll show you a couple slides on that. Then I'll show you a couple slides on some of the federal funding pieces as well. So it's here. And, so pre-COVID, January 2020, then that's the orange bar on the left. We were set up to implement the Student Opportunity Act. The governor proposed his budget and essentially said, okay, I'm ready to do this. I signed this into law. We're going to put $350 million additional dollars to begin the phase in of the Student Opportunity Act. And then boom, COVID hit. And, many parts of the state budget were struggling, including, funding K through 12. So the estimates on how much we could put in to fund the Student Opportunity Act through the state budget were ratcheted back pretty significantly. So you see that the estimate went down to about $100 million that we would be putting into implementing the Student Opportunity Act. And then the last bar, the blue bar, was that we finally were able to pass a budget that funded through the state, the Student Opportunity Act, at about half of what we originally were hoping for and proposing. So, then comes in the federal government, and you'll see these are 3 separate bars, 3 separate pots of funding. The orange bar was in about the spring of 2020, which the federal government, through the CARES Act that was passed, came through to support schools at, $437 million, which that money was essentially to address COVID relief, like needs that, whether it was PPP, whether it was ventilators, whether, just basic things to plug up holes from the disaster that was and continues to be COVID-19. And subsequent to that, in December of 2020, we got an additional pot of money, close to double of that, that also continued to address COVID-related needs, but then also, set up supports for continued social, emotional, above and beyond just kind of addressing the crisis, right? And then what we have in front of us is the American Rescue Plan, and these are very early estimates because we're still trying to get more concrete numbers. These are as accurate as we could make them at this point, is that we're going to get a fair bit of money through the American Rescue Plan for our schools, right? And that's great because, again, we need a strong state-federal partnership. A couple of things to say about the federal funds, though, is one, we need to make sure that the funds are transparently and equitably distributed, which some of that is in place because some of the money flows directly to low-income schools, right? But we really need to make sure that we know where those dollars are going and that they're going to support our districts that we know have been chronically underfunded for a long, long time. And while this is a big, seeing this like bar it seems like a lot of money, and it is going to put us in a good place to perhaps, plug up some holes to get us back on track to implement the Student Opportunity Act. It's fiscally irresponsible to think that we can rely on this level of federal funding in an ongoing way. And, what the Student Opportunity Act does is that every year we're going to have to put more and more money into it to get to the point in 7 years where we're adding $1.5 billion every year to our schools. So while this federal funding is critical, it is necessary. We also can't overly rely on this as plugging up our, the commitment that we made to students over the long term.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that information. So I'm wondering, the budget it really can't be a powerful tool, to build racial and economic justice, right? And especially to lead us out of this recovery right now. So I'm wondering, what solution do you see that could ensure that we get policies passed, not just passed, but also funded? Because I think right now we're talking about money that is in the books, but not being dispersed. And then we're also talking about some federal resources that need to be monitored, how they're also dispersed. But so I'm just wondering, how can we work towards policies, passing the policies actually?
Yeah, and it's, as we clearly see, just passing a policy doesn't create the changes in the outcomes that we want to see. And, I feel very strongly that we do not, and on all the efforts that went into passing the Student Opportunity Act, we don't want it to be another unfunded mandate. And, as part of our Envisioning Equity platform, and we believe strongly, and it's borne out in the research, that progressive tax changes are absolutely central to making sure that our budgets are equitable and achieve anti-racist outcomes, right? And that dollars are reaching Black and Latinx and, poor white communities out in the western part of the state to really address the chronic underfunding that we've done to those communities for decades. And as one of my colleagues, Brandon McCoy, likes to say, who runs a similar state policy group in New Jersey, math is real. So if you want to invest this much in schools, you need to be bringing in the amount of money to be able to, match that commitment. So like math is real, it's a budget, it needs to equal out. On the state level, we can't operate at a deficit. So, it's important that we raise the funds that we need, and it's important that we raise them in a way that's equitable, that we really ask folks who can afford it to really support schools, to support expanded transit in our communities, to make it so that everybody can have access to affordable healthcare, clean water, et cetera.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm trying to kind of be a bit optimistic, and I'm struggling with that. So I was wondering, for MassBudget, what do you see as your next steps? What's going to keep you folks? What are the things that you can predict are going to keep you busy in 2021? Because God knows we can't predict a lot these days. But where do you see things going?
What's going to keep us busy? Yeah, we'll stay busy. We're gonna continue to this when the American Rescue Plan, more of the details come out for kind of the policy wonk and budget wonk details come out, really wanting to make sure that those federal funds are really distributed equitably. And, you know, the work that we've been doing and will continue to do is, you know, working closely with partners to figure out, you know, it is about the taxes that are flowing in, the federal revenue that's flowing in, but how do we want to, you know, what's our vision for the future here? What do we want to spend these funds on? So, you know, we have some recent research that we've published outside of some of our K through 12 research. One report that I'm really excited about on free buses and how free buses can achieve lots of different forms of equity, help our environment, you know, essential workers and low-income folks. Really, I know my mom used to ride the bus all the time, really rely on it, and it can be a big hit to folks who aren't making a lot of money to pay for transit. So there are lots of things that together we can do through the public good. We just have to make sure that we have sustainable funding on the state level and on the federal level in order to do these things.
I'm excited to, number one, see the report, and then to continue in partnership and in conversation. So we have a few questions coming up. I'm going to read a couple, and if you would be so kind as to respond to them, Marie-Frances. I'm going to start with this one in particular. What is the likelihood of MassBudget equity framework being applied to the incoming dollars through CARE, the CRSA, ESER, et cetera? So new funding, how will the framework be applied if possible?
So that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think number one, there needs to be a level of transparency with the federal funds that are coming in and sort of who's making decisions on where these federal funds go to. Some of it is already predetermined by the federal government, like these funds will go to Title I schools. So some of it is already predetermined, but I think it's, you know, the funds that are more flexible, because there will be funds that are more flexible, will go directly to kind of the state budget. You know, we all need to partner together to decide what the priorities are going to be. And I feel strongly that communities that are chronically underfunded, it should be directed toward those communities, and they should be the ones to really kind of decide how those funds are spent. And we see communities like Chelsea that have been doing a lot of really great organizing work in order to do that. So, you know, we like to put ourselves in the lane of, like, we try to bring transparency, let you know what's going on with the numbers, and come to this conversation with really strong values, but also want to partner with folks so that we can have an inclusive conversation about how the dollars get spent.
Thank you. There's so many great questions, so I'm going to just try to go through them rather than pick and choose. But so let me put another one out there. So how can New England states that rely so heavily on property taxes to fund schools provide more equitable funding by changing the balance of how funding comes state taxes versus local property taxes? And I can reread that if I
yeah. So that is a really great question, and that is what the Student Opportunity Act aims to address. So essentially what the Student Opportunity Act does is that for lower income communities, it's going to raise the floor for how much the formula says we need to put into lower income school districts. It does. So the biggest part of the reform, it adds more money to, like, address a rising healthcare costs, some other things. But the biggest part of the reform is that it essentially says that for a low income student, what basically one of the pieces of the formula said that for a low income student, add $4,400 additional. It doubles that. So if you have a lot of low income students in your district, the floor for how much the state says that you need to provide, money that you need to provide for a quality education, is going to rise. So it's essentially shifting more state resources to those lower income school districts. So the chart that I showed about Brockton not getting XYZ funding through, and these top 10 districts, those are all districts with lower poverty wealth, lower incomes, and the bulk of the money in the Student Opportunity Act is state money that will flow to those low-income school districts. So that's the purpose of the Student Opportunity Act, to disrupt that.
So the following question just really resonates for me. Nellie, May, we are spending a lot of time around racial equity, trying to disrupt white supremacy. And in just reading about MassBudget, my hunch is that you folks are doing similar work. So, and knowing that we can't do this alone, that we need white allies in this work. So this question I'll pose for you. I think white communities should be rallied to support greater state funding for communities like Holyoke, Springfield, and others. How can people help?
Yeah, that's really great. And I would say, in many of the organizing spaces that we're part of, there are folks from Lexington, other, white suburban communities that are, working hand in hand with leaders of color and leaders from low-income communities to pass some of these. So I would say that some of that work is already happening. And I'm happy to connect with, I think it's Humera, directly to talk a little bit more about that. And, some of the work, we've also been partnering up with the Massing Polling Group, and they recently put out a poll on the state budget and taxes, and it was disaggregated by race. And it showed that, in white communities and Black and brown communities, people do support quality schools for everybody, regardless of your skin color, regardless of your income. So we know that folks around the state want quality education for young people, but I think it's, yes, about being kind of tapped into some of the organizing and some of the movement work that's happening.
So this is probably a good follow-up question. What would it take to repeal Proposition 2.5? How would this impact the budget?
I have no idea. What would it take? Oh my God, I don't know. I'm gonna have to get back to you on that. I really don't know. What kind of organizing it would take, and I don't know what the legal and policy. I don't know. I'll get back to you, whoever that is. Let me think about it.
I think several of us can help you think that through too, and think about different tactics.
And some of the OGs that have been doing this work for a long time, I'm sure would have a lot to say about that. MassBudget was essentially MassBudget's a 30-year-old organization, and essentially came out of the movement to cap property taxes and other things. So it's a really great question, and I can get back to you, Stephanie.
So the next is actually an offer for help. So this is excellent. How might small businesses grounded in equity in education partner with you? I would love to be a part of future discussions and possible decision making. So we'll need to take the person's name, but how can small businesses partner?
Yeah, no, this is really wonderful, and I mean, I think it's around. We really do believe, one of the pillars of our work is tax justice and tax adequacy too, and there's, I feel like, a misconception that anybody who's a business owner would be opposed to, a tax on wealthy people or things like that. And, we found through our relationships with, Black business owners and small business owners that that's not necessarily true, because business owners essentially understand that you need quality, well-funded schools in order, especially as a small business owner, to make sure that your community folks are educated and can work at your small business, or that they have the money that they need to support your small business, whatever it is that you're selling, and the businesses that you're stewarding in the community. So I would say, please connect with me, because we're always looking for small business folks or business folks that can really help articulate this point that we really need schools funded and lots of other things funded, right? Our road repair and things like that for businesses to operate and businesses to thrive.
Thank you. So there's still time for more questions if folks want to keep them coming. There's a wonderful question here that's asking about what keeps you motivated, what keeps you going to do this work?
Well, I would say my team is amazing. We have an amazing team at MassBudget of really smart analysts and communication folks, and we're all always driving each other. And then kind of our wider movement that we're part of, amazing folks also that are part of that, keeps me going. My son who's ready to enter Boston Public Schools certainly keeps me motivated. And I'm sure as I go through my Boston Public Schools journey, I'll be even more motivated to make sure that all students are really getting what they deserve. So my journey, what's brought me to this point too, and hearing stories like Delia's, which I didn't even know about.
Yeah. Still more to be told.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So another question, curious about why funding stagnated and dropped after the 90, that chart that you showed, what caused it to drop?
Yeah, so there are a couple of different things. I mean, there were tax cuts that happened during that time period, income tax cuts in the state budget, other sorts of compromises that were made that eventually led to some tax declines. And there were also other parts of the budget which increased. So like, health insurance, the healthcare part of the budget did also grow during that time. So a couple of different factors, but I would say those are the major ones. There were tax cuts that happened during that time. And also, the healthcare reforms, which aren't bad. I mean, we have one of, we have the most highly insured population in all of the United States. So those health reforms that really started in Massachusetts really did pay off for us as a whole. So, but the cost of providing healthcare through the state budget also increased.
So we're going to wind down, but before we close, I have two questions for you. One is, and you've touched on this, but I'm curious, what do you see as some of the bigger challenges? I know we've talked racial inequity, racism, all of that. Money means power, and people don't like to let go of power. But I'm curious, what are some of the bigger challenges for you or for us, because we're all impacted by this. You get to actually do the work, but we all get impacted. But I'm curious, challenges and opportunities. Before we close out, can you just say a couple things about those?
Yeah, so I covered a lot of things, and one policy in particular that I think is going to be quite a challenging one I think there is great opportunity. I think there is great support, and there are also great challenges to passing it, as well as the fair share amendment, which is essentially a tax on incomes over $1 million. So any household making over $1 million, a dollar that they make above $1 million would be taxed at an additional 4%. And this policy change requires a change to the Massachusetts Constitution, which happens every so often, happened during gay marriage. But it, I think it's going to be, it will hopefully be on the ballot in November of 2022. But it's going to be a road for us to get there, to build the support, and to really link this change in tax policy to all of the beautiful, amazing things that we could do in our communities with the estimates are that it would bring in $2 billion. So that's going to be a challenge and work, but an opportunity for MassBudget and for all of us to engage in that conversation.
I think it's a great way to leave this call. And I just want to say, I thank you. I really thank you for the work you're doing. I'm grateful for MassBudget for holding the light to the work and to reminding us about, the values live in people's budgets, and for pushing us to think differently. So I'm ready to say goodbye, but I want to also see if you have a last word will be yours.
I just want to say thank you to you, and we've known each other for, I think, close to a decade at this point.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah, and you've done such amazing work, and I know that you and others have really worked to transform Nellie May to be a very race forward and, on a journey of being an anti-racist organization as we are also on that journey at MassBudget. And I just want to give you kudos for doing that work, because it's really important.
Thank you. And
yeah,
I'm just going to say mando abrazos. And when the
Mando
world opens
abrazo.
up, we're going to get together. Okay?
Yeah, we're going to get together and have some cocktails. Okay.
I didn't say the cocktails, Marie-Frances. but I love you, and I'm grateful for our friendship. And I think just knowing we've known each other for 10 years, very proud of you.
I know. Thank you.
So you be well.
Okay.
And for our audience, thank you very much. This has been recorded. We will send out the recording, and I believe Marie-Frances is going to make the slides available as well.
Yes.
Thank you, and do look out for another conversation in